Thank you very much, Jason. I'd like to thank the Infrastructure Authority and the Board of Directors as well. So I am going to go old school. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to speak from some notes, and I will save ample time at the end so we can have a discussion and some Q&A. I would very much welcome feedback and dialogue. So I'm going to begin by explaining what the Carbon Management Institute is. Then I'll touch upon why carbon capture and storage and carbon capture utilization and storage remains an imperative for the state of Wyoming as a greenhouse gas mitigation technology. I'll talk a little bit about where we are in terms of policies with respect to carbon management, and then I'll bring it home with some thoughts about where I think these developments and what they mean for the state of Wyoming and Gillette in particular. So what is the Carbon Management Institute? The Carbon Management Institute is part of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. And it is focused on a suite of technologies that we think are very important to continue to grow the coal industry. So the primary technology we are focused on is geologic sequestration, which, as everyone knows, you can capture CO2 from an industrial source or from a power plant. You can put it in a pipeline, and then you can safely store it underground in a variety of geologic formations, including deep saline reservoirs and also through a process called carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, where you can use the CO2 to recover more oil, and then as part of that process, that CO2 is stored as part of that process. So I have the privilege of running a team of geologists and hydrogeologists and geophysicists who wake up every day focused on how can we advance the state of the technology with respect to the geologic storage aspect of that technology. So that is what the CMI does. In terms of the School of Energy Resources, more broadly, as you know, SER wakes up every day trying to advance technologies that are broadly supportive of the extractive industries in the state of Wyoming, but particularly coal. So SER is engaged in new initiatives such as carbon engineering, which involves the non-BTU utilization of carbon. So we can talk about some of those initiatives as well. But I'm here today to talk about where we are with respect to geologic sequestration, the status of research and projects, and my own views as to what I think this means with respect to the state of Wyoming. So first off, why are we talking about sequestration? We're talking about sequestration because, for better or for worse, these climate policies are in place, and they seem to be embedded, and they don't seem to be going away. And those policies exist at the international level, they exist at the regional level, and they certainly exist at the state level in some states. So internationally, for example, you've all heard of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was executed last December. It is just a day or two away from taking the force of law, although it's not going to be enforced as a legal requirement in the United States. Just this morning when I was driving over here, I heard that the EU has ratified the Paris Agreement. So the bottom line is that we are a day or two away from having the international community ratify a new climate treaty that will take effect in 2020, and that treaty will set as aspirational policy goals the effective decarbonization of all energy systems by 2050. Let me repeat that again. Whether you agree with the international policy or not, whether you agree with the Paris Agreement or not, many countries around the world, indeed most developed countries around the world, have signed on to this document that calls for the decarbonization of all energy systems by 2050. And if you read the literature, that is believed to be necessary in order to cap the increase in surface temperatures to 1.5 degrees C, if possible, by 2050. Now, what does this have to do with geologic sequestration? Again, if you read the technical literature, geologic storage is believed to be one of the primary technologies that is going to be available to the fossil fuel industry in order to achieve these goals. And notice I'm using the term fossil fuel industry, not just the coal industry, because all these carbon mitigation technologies are not just about coal. Indeed, under U.S. law, natural gas-fired facilities are currently subject to these carbon management requirements. So I always hear, well, sequestration is an obligation on coal. That certainly is true, but it always has been also about natural gas as well, and indeed the policy guns are now pivoting towards the natural gas industry. So with respect to the Carbon Management Institute and the School of Energy Resources, we also think we are waking up every day to help fight for the natural gas industry as well as a critical part of the state of Wyoming economy. So that's the international framework. The Paris Agreement is poised to take effect. It will start to have teeth in 2020. And that is what it is. Unless the U.S. Senate chooses to bring litigation to claim that this is a treaty that was enacted by the Obama administration in contravention of the Constitution's treaty clause, the Paris Agreement will have effect in the United States. And that's notable because you all know the Kyoto Protocol, which is the current international framework, the United States never ratified. Well, we have signed up to the Paris Agreement. The Obama administration has signed up to the Paris Agreement. And unless the Senate, through litigation at the Supreme Court, strikes that act down, that will be the international policy environment in which we will be living as of 2020. So that's the international level. At the federal level, some of the Clean Air Act programs that deal with obligations on major industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions are in place and also have been upheld by the Supreme Court. Sometimes I give these talks and people will say, oh, well, there's no federal cap and trade. I hear there's a lot of litigation going on. So these federal programs, it looks like everything's in flux. That's true in part. But the core of these programs that apply both, again, to natural gas-fired facilities and coal-fired facilities are in place. They have been upheld by the Supreme Court, and they are the law of the land. Now, there are some additional carbon management programs that the Obama administration has been rolling out that do remain subject to litigation. So we've all heard about the Clean Power Plan, for example. So oral argument in the D.C. Circuit on the Clean Power Plan occurred last week. There's a whole other suite of final rules that are subject to litigation in the courts as well. And it's unclear how that litigation is going to result. But the bottom line is the Supreme Court, in my view, largely has already upheld the authority of EPA to do what it's doing. People may disagree with how it is going about doing it, and people may disagree with how a particular program or statutory provision is being interpreted, but I think the ship has sailed on whether the bulk of the federal jurisdiction of EPA to largely do what it's doing is valid. I believe that has been upheld. So again, we're largely in the state of Wyoming, that is the federal policy environment that we're stuck with. I'll also offer the view, I mean, I'm a chemical engineer and a lawyer. I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. Practicing Clean Air Act law. And even if programs like the Clean Power Plan are ultimately struck down, in my experience, it will come back. These programs are a bit like chewing gum on the bottom of your shoe. They never go away. So it is possible, yes, that the D.C. Circuit may strike down the Clean Power Plan, or it may go to the Supreme Court and be struck down. But as long as EPA generally has this broad authority, it's more than likely that future administrations will make another run at it. So I would not, if the Clean Power Plan is struck down, conservatively, I would not take great comfort from that. I think it's more than likely you would see that reemerge in a future administration in 2019, 2022, whatever it may be. So that's the policy framework at the federal level. Now, certainly in some states, we've all seen what Oregon, the statute that Oregon has passed. The folks in this room are more intimately acquainted with, the fate of these coal export terminals. So as you look throughout the United States, there are no shortage of individual states, many of which are current consumers of Wyoming coal or were consumers of Wyoming coal, that also have adopted current policies regarding carbon management. And I don't see those policies going away, even if for some reason, for some unanticipated reason, the Paris Agreement disappears and these federal laws disappear. I think we are in an environment in which greenhouse gas emissions are going to be reduced. And that is the reality of the fossil fuel industry generally, and certainly for the coal industry. I'm telling you all this because actually I'm completely optimistic about the fate of the fossil fuel industry. I'm completely optimistic about the coal industry. I moved to Wyoming because I believe passionately about coal. I believe passionately about technology. I believe the coal industry's best days are ahead of it. And why is that? Because if you look at the history of coal, coal has faced comparable environmental challenges over the years in terms of emission controls on NOx, SOx, particulate matter, you name it, every one of which was accompanied by these dire predictions that this is just really bad news for coal. And yes, that's true up until a point, but in almost every instance, technology has stood up and enabled coal to meet those challenges. And I have no reason to doubt why emissions of CO2 would be any different. So having painted this picture of, wow, there are challenges, I'm standing up in front of you as a technically focused, passionate pro-coal person who believes that coal's best days are ahead of it. Indeed, that's why I moved here last year. So in terms of that policy framework, where does that get you in terms of carbon capture and storage? Under most of these programs, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and certainly also we think under the Paris Agreement, capturing and storing CO2 in the subsurface is generally recognized as the preferred technology pathway. And I'll just give you an example. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, under one of these programs, I won't bore you with all these Cleaner Act acronyms, has recognized the use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery as a greenhouse gas mitigation technology for coal. So if you are going to build a new coal-fired power plant, for example, EPA has said, if you can make the economics work, and I'm not trivializing the economics, I'm not up here being Pollyannish, but EPA has said if you can economically capture that CO2, put it in a pipeline, get it to an oil field, and use it for EOR, that counts. That's your emission control technology. My bottom line theme, I'll come to this at the end of my talk, is geologic sequestration remains absolutely imperative for the state of Wyoming, and that's why the University of Wyoming, the School of Energy Resources, and the group I run, the Carbon Management Institute, wakes up every day trying to advance that technology and reduce those costs. So that, from the 10,000 foot level, is the policy framework, and that is why I'm up here today talking about geologic sequestration. So now I want to pivot to, so what are some of the current hot topics on geologic sequestration? And I really think that there are two or three. And again, I'm going quickly here. We could talk days on this topic. The first one is, I had mentioned that EPA has recognized if you're doing CO2 EOR, CO2 enhanced oil recovery, that counts as storage from the point of view of the industrial sources or power plants air permit. That is true. However, there's a little wrinkle. EPA has said that the oil field, the EOR owner operator, also has to utilize a federally approved monitoring, reporting, and verification plan, and an MRV plan is what that is called. There is currently, I think it can be charitably said, disagreements in the oil and gas industry about their ability or willingness to adopt that federal MRV plan. To date, EPA has only approved one such plan, and that was for Occidental Petroleum at the Denver unit in the Permian Basin. And we can talk about that MRV plan if you want. There are others in the EOR industry that believe adopting a federal MRV plan is effectively inviting that federal regulator into the oil field and turning that oil field into a federally regulated CO2 landfill, which is not their business. These EOR companies are not in the storage business. CO2 storage occurs as part of their operations, but they're in the business of producing oil and gas. Some of these companies do not want to invite EPA in to supervise their operations to check on the suitability of the CO2 storage operations. So that's sort of one, so there's a lot going on internationally at the federal level and in some of these states on can an oil and gas company actually do an MRV plan to enable the CO2 source, say a coal-fired power plant, meet its emission reduction obligation. Secondly, one thing that's exceedingly fascinating for the state of Wyoming is, as many of you know, CalISO and PacifiCorp are currently in the midst of this effort to integrate the Western grid. Although, as I understand it, that's now somewhat stalled legislatively in California, and certainly this is also not a topic that is not without disagreement. So Governor Meade, I believe, previously has submitted written comments on this, stating some of the concerns that the state of Wyoming has with respect to this Western integration grid operation. But I'm not talking about it on the policy side. From the technology side, however, I think the day is coming, and this might be 2025, 2030, pick a year, when a coal-fired power plant in Wyoming is capturing and sequestering its CO2 and then selling that electricity into the Western grid in a way that meets those carbon requirements. So from a CCS point of view, this Western grid integration movement is quite fascinating. Indeed, there was an academic paper published by Stanford a couple years ago where they looked at the Jim Bridger plant and they made the case that based upon the carbon price in California, based upon the retail price of electricity, that carbon capture and storage was economic at the Jim Bridger plant under those then economic conditions. So I find that whole topic to be utterly fascinating. Thirdly, as you know, California is also hinting that it's going this way. California is in the midst of adopting policies and methodologies that would recognize geologic sequestration for purposes of its various climate programs, like cap and trade and the low carbon fuel standard. Last but not least, ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is in the fourth year of a multi-year process to publish and to develop and publish the world's first technical standards for geologic sequestration. And actually, I have the privilege of chairing that ISO panel that is developing the technical standard for the conditions under which you can store CO2 during EOR. And it's anticipated that by the end of 2018, that standard will be published. And then you'll have a document, if you will, that people can look to and say, well, if we follow this guidance, then this will be a good thing for the coal-fired power plant. So that's where we are in terms of some highlights on changing policies. So where are we in terms of research? And here I'll put back on my Carbon Management Institute hat. Again, speaking from the School of Energy Resources and the Carbon Management Institute, we see no decrease whatsoever in the appetite of the federal government, the Department of Energy in particular, to issue grant proposals to fund these types of research endeavors. Indeed, I'm happy to say, in these tight budgetary times in the state of Wyoming, the Carbon Management Institute is almost exclusively funded by federal grants. And indeed, we're at max capacity, and we still have more pending applications in the queue. So we wake up every day, go on to grants.gov, look at what's available in terms of federal funding, and we chase those dollars down. And this is where it's absolutely wonderful and a privilege to be in Wyoming, because Wyoming gets it. Wyoming loves technology. They understand energy. They're progressive on the policy front. Wyoming is one of the only states that has adopted a legal framework governing the conditions under which you can conduct sequestration. So Wyoming has always been on the cutting edge of the curve in trying to attract and develop these types of technologies. And again, that's why it's a privilege to be here. That's why I moved here. So what are some of the projects that the University of Wyoming is currently working on with respect to sequestration? We currently are one of the lead partners on this grant program called the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which is a joint U.S.-China multi-million-dollar 5-year program that is looking at CO2 storage during EOR. Indeed, 2 of my team members are currently in China now. So when you hear about these bilateral deals between Wyoming and China, or the federal government and China, you just need to know the University of Wyoming, whether it's transparent or not, is one of the lead players in those research projects. We're currently still working on what's known as phase 1 of this brine extraction storage test. And again, all these are federally funded programs. That's where we are looking at the Rock Springs uplift, which is just outside of Rock Springs in southwestern Wyoming. The Rock Springs uplift is one of the most heavily studied and characterized deep saline storage sites in the United States, if not the world. So we're currently in the midst of still doing some desktop evaluations of how can you maximize and facilitate and better control CO2 injections into a saline reservoir by simultaneously extracting and producing brines, and then producing those brines to make beneficial products, making potable water, whatever it may be. Thirdly, we have 2, and this is why it's a real privilege to be here in Gillette. We have 2 applications in on a separate application called Carbon Safe, and I won't bore you with what that acronym means, but DOE is trying to launch by 2025 commercial saline storage sites throughout the United States. So the Carbon Management Institute, with various partners, including EERC in North Dakota and others, put in 2 applications, one of which was for Dry Fork Station with the ITC. The other was again at the Rock Springs uplift in conjunction with the Jim Bridger power plant in Pacific, which is owned by Pacificor. So we think both of those applications are competitive. Those awards will be announced at the end of October. We have fingers crossed that we may win one or both of those. If one or both of those come in, then the state of Wyoming is on track towards having a commercial saline site by 2025. Now granted, again, I'm not being Pollyannish. There are lots of hurdles here. These are multi-step grants, but we're in there fighting every day. Just a couple other thoughts beyond the sequestration point, but similar to what are we doing to help the coal industry. And here I have to give kudos to Don Collins. I actually thought if you wanted a much more effective public speaker, showing a much more informed public speaker on these topics, you should have had Mr. Collins at the podium. So the University of Wyoming has great privilege to be working with WRI on a suite of technologies involving the utilization of CO2. Indeed, under Don's leadership and WRI's leadership, a recent application has gone in. I think that's all I can say about that. Also on the research front, as many of you know, the School of Energy Resources more broadly is looking at technologies to extract the non-BTU value of coal. So we're not talking about displacing or anticipating a day when coal is no longer burned for electricity. We're looking at how can you supplement those markets with additional market opportunities. So again, with great credit to the Wyoming legislature, who appropriated a non-trivial amount of funds for this, we are well along, I guess, at the end of the first year on this carbon engineering initiative, where we're taking a hard look at, for these coal mines out here, what can you do with that coal in addition to burning it for electricity? Well, lo and behold, there are pathways to go to carbon fibers. There are pathways to go to other products. So we're looking for the day when not only is the great state of Wyoming exporting coal for electricity generation, it's producing carbon fibers in the state and exporting carbon fibers to the state of Washington, to Boeing, so they can produce aircraft bodies and fuselages. So that's another area of interest. Also, the Carbon Management Institute, it's somewhat confusing because this doesn't fit within our name. We also are doing a significant amount of work on rare earth elements. And again, this is an area that has, we've seen ample and growing federal interest in terms of grant opportunity and funding. So we currently are operating under several federally funded grants with respect to what are the opportunities to extract commercially rare earth elements from coals, from coal ash, from coal byproducts. We just recently received a grant to look at the recovery of rare earth elements from produced water. So we're doing a significant amount of work on rare earth elements. We think this will provide, hopefully, beneficial returns to the state of Wyoming as well. So I have 5 more minutes. I just want to briefly cover 2 more topics on the project front. So people will say, wow, Kipp, you stand up and give all these optimistic talks about carbon capture and storage. Where are the projects? Where are the projects, right? I mean, that's a fair criticism. I'm up here singing this wonderful story about carbon capture and storage. Where are the projects? Well, there actually are projects. Kemper, for example, Petronova, many of them are down on the Gulf Coast. They are coming online. There are existing projects online around the world. But again, the example I always give is that it feels as if we are at Kitty Hawk and that plane has gone 200 feet down the beach, and then everyone says, where are the blueprints for the 747? I mean, these are complex, multi-billion-dollar projects with challenging economics. But even still, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, projects are moving forward. So I think you have to judge the project side on a long time scale. We're talking about what projects can be put in the ground by 2050, by 2060. We need to be looking at that type of time frame instead of, well, it's Tuesday, what project's going to start operating tomorrow. I just think that's unfair, and it's not consistent with the technology development path, and it does a disservice to the complex nature of some of these first mover projects anyway. So again, on the project front, I'm also optimistic. There are a handful of projects coming online. There are more in the queue. Do I think the day is coming when every coal-fired power plant in the United States is going to be equipped with CCS technology? No. And I don't know anyone who believes that. Some of that is for reason of geology. There are some regions of the country where, because of the subsurface and the lack of a pipeline infrastructure, you just are not going to see these projects, certainly not anytime soon. But there are areas of the country with favorable geology and savvy policymakers and existing CO2 infrastructure, such as pipelines, where I think you will see more of these early mover projects. And really there are 2 regions that come to mind. One is here, and God bless the state of Wyoming, and the other is the Permian Basin. And I think we'll be seeing more of these projects move forward. So I will conclude here on time with just 2 minutes to go. What does all of this mean for the state of Wyoming? I believe that commercializing carbon capture storage technology remains an absolute imperative for the state of Wyoming. That is because this technology has been identified by policymakers as one of, if not the primary, carbon mitigation technical pathways for the utilization of coal. Secondly, I think carbon capture and storage is not just about coal. This is also about the utilization of natural gas. So if you're the project developer of an LNG import terminal, before you can get your permit, you have to demonstrate to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that it's technically and economically incapable for you to capture CO2 and store it via the enhanced oil recovery. And thirdly, I will say that I am incredibly bullish about technology. I cannot think of a major societal issue, whether you believe it or not, that has not been solved with technology. And I don't know why these sets of issues would be any different, and it's a privilege to be working at the University of Wyoming on trying to advance these technologies. And again, I will repeat, I do believe that coal's best days are ahead of it. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kipp. We've got time for some questions here, and I see Mr. Sparks is geared up and ready.
Well, we're going to hope that your optimism is reminiscent of the peak oil negativity that went on, if everyone here remembers that, about what you do with carbon. I have two questions. I like your technology focus. If you could, I'll ask the easy one first. In what you see evolving, is biomass considered is the CO2 that comes from combusting biomass for generation, let's say, is that by definition a greenhouse gas in what you're seeing?
I will speak in terms of what the current federal policy is, not my personal views. Biomass is one of those convoluted areas that you would not think is convoluted. So the answer is nobody knows. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has spent years trying to come up with a biomass methodology to assess whether co-firing biomass could be used for compliance purposes under the Clean Power Plan. That process generally has stalled, and there is academic literature, believe it or not, that would suggest that if you're burning a tree, you're on a life cycle basis, you're creating more greenhouse gas emissions than burning coal. There was a notable Massachusetts study from several years ago that reached that conclusion. So you would think that, wow, co-firing with biomass, we've got a lot of beetle kill pine, just toss it in the boiler. That is a complicated and unresolved federal policy matter. I will put out a plug here for Emily Beagle at the University of Wyoming. She just published, she's working on her PhD in engineering. She just published a paper looking at the life cycle analysis of beetle kill trees and co-firing in Wyoming utilities and Colorado utilities with respect to Clean Power Plan compliance. So there are people focused on this as a policy matter and technical matter, but it's unresolved.
And just for everyone's benefit, about 2 years ago, we had a WIA conference in California where biomass was one of the exceptions to their carbon policy. So California was even exempting out biomass at the time. I don't know if things have changed since then, but that's just kind of an FYI.
Yeah.
The bigger question I have is, it's fascinating that ISO thinks that a standard can be developed, which obviously is going to have to be very tightly defined in some very well-proven situations. And so thinking about that standard, and I take it that if you deployed a sequestration technology that meets that standard, you're golden from a liability standpoint, in theory, from the way standards are supposed to work. But there's been some recent publications about and stories about the earthquakes caused by the reinjection of brine in the Oklahoma oil fields, causing earthquake situations, and people are worried about how you deal with earthquake risk for any kind of permanent storage and reinjection, and how you make sure the pressures remain the right way, because if you're wrong, then it all gets released or fouls something else. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about where technology is going in that and why that's looking to be a more promising thing?
Absolutely. So those are great questions. So the question was, what is the state of the research on induced seismicity as an aspect in these projects and research? Induced seismicity certainly is an issue for projects and for technology, and it's a subject of ongoing research. In the CCS side, unlike the reinjection of produced waters from hydraulic fracturing, there is ample comfort that those risks are mitigated if not reduced. So for example, Japan has done sample, relatively small scale CO2 injections within what we would consider to be seismically interesting zones. And they've seen no issues. California is well now down the path of trying to allow, as a matter of law and policy, geologic sequestration. They certainly don't want to activate any of their faults. I will say, and this is where it's utterly interesting for CO2 EOR. CO2 EOR, by its mere commercial nature, mitigates those risks because you are maintaining the pressure, the ambient pressure of the reservoir, because not when you're injecting CO2, you're producing oil, and that is maintaining the pressure of the reservoir. So you really have greatly reduced induced seismicity risk in CO2 EOR. At most, it is a consideration with respect to saline reservoirs where it's arguably more of a closed system. But yes, it's a fair point. It's a matter of research, but I certainly don't see that as a technological block, and I certainly don't see it at the moment as a policy block where folks are just saying, sorry, you can't do CCS here because we're worried about earthquakes.
Mr. Coddington, could you tell us what do we know about how well sequestered CO2 remains sequestered?
We know we have tremendously great confidence that the CO2 will stay there. And the best example is nature. So there are natural CO2 domes. Indeed, that's where the bulk of the CO2 used for EOR comes from today, like McElmo Dome. CO2 has been stored over geologic time in natural geologic traps, and it has stayed there. So when you're injecting into a well-characterized reservoir, you would talk to a geologist and they would say, we have great certainty it's going to stay there. There's also a lot of well understood physical and chemical and other trapping mechanisms where that process is well understood. People sort of think, oh, well, you've got this balloon of CO2 down there. No, what you're doing, you are beating these CO2 molecules into a rock. You're trying to cram it into a minuscule pore space. And indeed, if you wanted to get it out, you really couldn't. So there is tremendous, that I guess is one of the ironies of it. There is tremendous confidence on the subsurface side that, yeah, this works. And, I could get depose 1,000 scientists worldwide and they would say the same thing. The challenges are more on the economic side, which you can't trivialize. It costs millions of dollars to build a pipeline. Your coal-fired utilities are, fighting against the price of natural gas, so there are core economic issues there. And you also still have these policy hurdles. People will say, okay, well, we know it's going to stay down there for 1 million years, but what happens if something goes wrong in year 100 and we're all dead? Who's going to be responsible for it? So the problems, I would say, are less technical than policy and economic, but there's tremendous confidence on the technical side.
Just a question on the producing brine out of the saline aquifers. Did I hear you mention correctly that there are some there's some research going on to actually see if that brine or that production can be turned into some sort of useful products besides water? Could you elaborate on that if you know anything?
Absolutely, and I can give you more details about that. This was a project by DOE under a grant that was titled BEST. B-E-S-T was the acronym, which stands for Brine Extraction and Storage Test. It's currently in phase 2. We are still in phase 1. Phase 1 was desktop studies. Phase 2 was actually funding a water treatment plant, drilling a well, producing brine, and then building a water treatment facility at the surface. We were not selected for phase 2. We are still in phase 1. But DOE has selected 5 projects throughout the United States for phase 2. where they are currently now in the early stages of a multi-year process to drill a well into a saline reservoir, and then either injecting CO2 or injecting a fluid to simulate CO2 if they cannot acquire CO2, and do research on the pressurization of the reservoir, how you control the pressurization of the reservoir, how you can produce brine, and then treat the brine to make any of a variety of beneficial projects. And I could put you in touch with the 5 winning research teams, and you could get samples of brine, or you could talk to them. But yes, that work is going on. Unfortunately, we're not one of the teams selected for phase 2. We're still in phase 1.
Hey, Kipp. Kipp also chaired a study recently for the National Coal Council to respond to requests from Secretary of Energy Moniz about what are the opportunities for utilizing CO2 in addition to EOR. And I was wondering if you could share some of the key highlights from that study that was just released at the end of August.
Absolutely. So the National Coal Council, and again, Don is also on the National Coal Council, probably several of you are as well. So the National Coal Council just published a paper on utilization of CO2, what are the opportunities for coal, and it divided those pockets into 2 buckets. One was utilizing CO2 in geologic formations, which I've been talking about, and the other was utilizing CO2 for chemicals and other aspects. Again, I have to give a shout out to Don Collins. He was exceedingly helpful on thoughtful, deep thinking on that paper and helping to frame it, and also making clear that we had a great understanding of a variety of technologies. What that paper concluded was, from a commercial and economic point of view, and certainly from a volume of CO2 that could be absorbed point of view, the geologic options remained preferable over utilizing CO2 in non-geologic options. So the paper broadly concluded, and here I'm simplifying, storing CO2 during enhanced oil recovery has greater potential to absorb massive volumes of CO2 than taking that CO2 molecule and taking it to a fuel. But that's not to say those other non-geologic technological pathways should not be pursued. We advise DOE very strongly to look at those other pathways. Those, from a pure economic point of view, those pathways could generate a lot of returns. And again, you have to be very humble in this business. Someone that can look at an early stage technology today and predict its success or doom 10 years from now does not have the right humility to be in this business. There could be a technology, event scale technology today, that could be the solution in 2025. So we need to be advancing all boats. But the paper then concluded with some methodologies that DOE could potentially use to rank order some of these technologies. But again, I thought that paper was fairly optimistic about CO2. It's just a molecule. It can be used as a feedstock. It can be used productively. Largely, these issues are economic. Let's get busy to try to reduce those costs to help the fossil fuel industry.
So maybe if I could kind of rephrase that. The study results was focused on how do we maximize this large quantity of CO2 that's being emitted by energy systems, and really concluded that storing it and sequestering it offered the opportunity to use the most of that CO2, making these other products from CO2 still could be commercially viable, and was something that was encouraged the department to research. But the concern was the total amount of CO2 that could be utilized would not be enough to capture all the CO2 from the energy systems unless there was some other, disruptive technology breakthrough. And I just want to kind of emphasize that part. From your comment, I could see where some of these coal power plants aren't amenable to sequestration and enhanced oil recovery because of their location. Then they may be the preferred sites for carbon utilization.
Absolutely.
Technologies. And so through that portfolio of solution options, we really can maximize the benefits for coal power plants throughout the United States based on what is geologically the best solution to deploy at those sites.
And again, you're too modest to say it, but WRI is doing some of the best cutting edge work on that area that I know. And that is a truth. That is a truth.
Megan?
Well, thanks, Kipp, for your remarks. As you may be aware, Cloud Peak Energy is extremely supportive of CCS technology, and we really see it as the crucial pathway forward for our industry. And as I've always seen it, two of the largest challenges that we have is, of course, the public and political awareness and agreement on this, and then also in terms of funding. And you alluded a little bit to the grants that you all are looking towards. Is that an issue as I've expressed, or do you feel like there is adequate funding moving forward?
As a federally funded academic research, we will always take researcher. We will always take more dollars. But yes, could the federal government in particular be putting more dollars into this? Yes, but I'm loath to criticize the Department of Energy because they're actually doing a really good job. So again, at the moment, the Carbon Management Institute, we are fully funded through the current fiscal year. We have pending grant applications that will push us out for another couple of years. So we're not hurting for research dollars. Now, if more dollars were put into it, could the technology be expedited? Yes. But I think everyone has to live within a budget-constrained environment, and I'm not going to be one of these people that stands up here and says, forget all the other technologies, just write a check to us. I think difficult decisions have to be made at the federal and state level. We're acutely cognizant of that, but so yes, more would be nice, but I think good, steady progress is being made on the federal funding point of view. Certainly public acceptance is a consideration, but again, there's been lots of papers published on that too, and if you do this right, I think the public acceptance issues, to the extent they exist, can be mitigated as well.
All right, any additional, David?
Kipp, this is a question on the economics of carbon capture. You mentioned the University of Wyoming's participation in the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. I'm wondering if Chinese carbon capture technology is less expensive than some of the U.S. technologies that have been developed that have been found to be so expensive at Kemper and otherwise. What's your assessment of the economics of that?
I think on the CO2 capture side, and again, I'm primarily focused on the subsurface piece, so I'm not as articulate on the CO2 capture technology. Certainly the economics as I should be. Certainly many of the more popular technologies like amine capture from Mitsubishi, those are already developed in the Far East, and many of those are being used here today. Certainly because of different governmental structures, it is possible that you may see a CO2 capture technology developed in a more expeditious way in that part of the world than here. And that's one of the reasons why we're interested in China. If you can prove this out anywhere in the world, then it can be used here. If you can do it faster in another part of the world, then that also helps the state of Wyoming. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying I don't really know, but I would have to get back to you on that. Certainly we were selected by DOE to help with some of these issues in China and jointly in Wyoming because the thought was there could be economic returns to Wyoming stakeholders and the United States if some of these technologies were developed there instead of here, at least in the early stages.
All right, any additional questions for Kipp? Seeing none, thank you for taking the time.
Privileged
up
to be here. Thank you, Jason. Yeah.